Welcome, viewers, to this new episode of Beyond Phrenology. We have with us today Professor Hudson from Linwood University in Missouri. He's a little different guest than what we had so far. We were very focused on cognitive neuroscience, but now we have discussed, how close cognitive neuroscience is to AI, and in general, how much we use AI in academics these days. Professor Hudson is one of the best minds you can hear from regarding how AI is percolating in education and how it is reshaping education. And that's the topic of our today's interest. So, Professor Hudson, welcome to Beyond Phrenology, and it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I love that you started off with neuroscience in that focus because we just had last week an announcement that is going to change education moving forward in that Johns Hopkins, Stanford, and a group of other leading research institutions found that we can actually subconsciously teach people things without them knowing it. And so, not reading, not reinforcing in traditional educational strategies, but just when someone is unconscious, you can create these types of memories for learning, and then this is going to change base level learning. So, what if we could start with basic reading and writing and arithmetic, and then
Yeah.
build from there? So, it's going to be a wild ride the next 10 years.
Or is it so? So, where does technology come into that, or is it on the basic educational side of things? Or
No, yeah, that's from the neuroscience side of things. So the
yeah.
neuroscience of learning, and so it just has the potential and shows where we're going, especially with brain-computer interface, right, which
Hmm.
is going to be attached to our smart glasses, which already exists at this time. So we just need to look at what is happening and what actually exists with
Yeah.
technology. We get a good idea of where we're going.
So, Professor Hudson, when I look at your background, you have expertise spanning very different fields. For instance, you can speak very, in an expert manner in artificial intelligence, neurodiversity. I noticed that you have experience with, neurodiverse populations with immersive realities, gamification of education, and you also are in art history. So very, very kind of a unique perspective. Normally, we see and hear from people who are solely technology focused, right?
Yeah.
So could you give a little background on how is it that you were able to mix, these kind of expertise and especially your education focus?
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah. So it's always my philosophy that you shouldn't fight the river or fight the flow. That being domain expertise is becoming more fluid and less, siloed. So we're going to need people that have multidisciplinary and work in interdisciplinary teams in order to solve larger wicked problems. But the story of how that came to be was my father was an artist. He taught art for 30 years. I was going to be an artist, got a BA in oil painting, then decided I'd rather look at the cultural side of what this actually means for various societies and being able to, as a storyteller, explain that in these types of narrative structures, right, to audiences. So I went in and got an MA and a PhD in art history, came out here to start up the art history department in 2010. By 2016, I was made assistant dean, head of online and graduate programs, which we didn't have any at the time. So I made 25 of those programs, but I didn't know anything about it. So I had to go back and retool. So every time something is changing, and this is really important for what we're looking at the next 10 years, everyone will need to retool or reskill in some area. So we need to really develop these metacognitive skills. At the time, it was just based out of necessity. So I got another graduate degree in leadership so I can understand business and accounting and how that side of things works, management, which I didn't know before. And then the pandemic hit, right? And we were trying to find a way to collapse the space between the learner and the teacher or between student to student interaction. So I was put in charge of virtual reality across the institution. So I went and got a graduate degree in game design to force myself to learn these gaming engines because otherwise these physics engines are very complex and if you don't have the motivation, you give up. So I did that. I set up our XR and gaming lab. I oversee human subject research in that area as well, across the institution. I set up the VR champions, right? That being individuals in every area that wanted to integrate this type of immersive learning, from paramedicine to education, to identify, students that might have dyslexia or need extra help, learning to read. To my field was the easiest because I could control it, and everything that we cover, we need to take someone to the physical locations, whether it's the Louvre or the pyramids of Giza or wherever, the Great Wall of China. So it worked perfectly for that. So we then started doing more research there. Then we restructured in our organization, and my new dean, Kathy Vasovich, told me to look at artificial intelligence. And that was 2021, a year before the stable launch, exactly a year before the stable launch of ChatGPT in 2022, in November. And so the first thing we did was look at, and I set up the AI ambassadors, same strategy, second verse, same as the first, individuals that were interested in showcasing how this was already being used across every field. And that is the main thing that educators seem to be taken by surprise of what's happening now with AI. It was always there, right? So back to the 1950s, people just weren't aware of how ingrained it was in our curriculum, in our assessment. We've been using AI to automatically assess essays with, ACT going back to the beginning of 2004, right? So this
Hmm.
is not this is
Right.
not new. So we set that up, and then generative AI hit, and we realized this is going to be a big thing. We realized this is going to change fundamentally how we teach. So I went and got a PhD in artificial intelligence. The neurodiversity side of it came in when my son was diagnosed level 2 autism. We got him an educational IEP. And then I as well was late diagnosed, right, as well with autism. And so we really started looking at how we can use technology in order to improve the quality of life, but also learning strategies for neurodiverse populations, because they are quite different with sensory processing considerations, different ways in which you can either read or speak or see or do. So we had to provide that kind of multimodal approach.
Right. Also, a lot of chance events as well as a lot of necessities, on the way.
Mhm.
That was power packed. So let's start with like the terminologies. So two things. One is, what exactly do you mean by AI? Because you said that we have been using, automated, for instance, review process in ACTs, going back to 2004, right?
Mhm.
And probably other domains as well, right? I mean, probably airline companies for booking tickets have been using AI for forever. But it is a lot new for consumers who are using it for the first time, especially the generative side of AI, right?
Mhm.
So where do we draw a distinction between what exactly is new here,
Mhm.
especially in the context of education, and to give a perspective to viewers, how fast are things moving at the level of education? We see these rollouts of different large language models, day and night, but what is changing at the level of how we learn skills? And you said that we need to be able to learn very fast and adapt very fast. So what are we looking for in that?
Exactly. And so, in talking to computer science students, what's amazing is they think that AI came about in 2022 with ChatGPT. So they're like, it's brand new, it just came about, etc. So it's very interesting in the lack of kind of historical perspective. So remember
Yeah.
that, AI as a catch-all is really just a term the public was using in the early 2000s as any type of technology, right? That did some type of advanced interaction, usually natural language processing, like Siri or Alexa or something. But we go back to the 1950s, right? So AI really is three different main branches. We tell people, computer vision, right? Training it to see the world, right? So then we have self-driving cars, etc. We have the smart glasses, which are going to be very important for accessibility and the elderly population. As well as neurodiverse populations. You have, again, machine learning, which is numbers, right? So that being through these machine learning algorithms, we can process big data if we convert it to ones and zeros and find insights. So that has been around, right, for 70 years. And then, of course, you're going to have natural language processing, which probably you could argue took the longest to make available to the general public in a really functional way. If you think of, talk to text back when the first iPhones came out,
Right.
2007, they were really hit or miss, right? They didn't really pick up what you were saying, and you'd always have to go back and fix it.
Hmm.
So that really took the longest. So what we're seeing now, and remember that OpenAI was training ChatGPT since 2015 when the company was founded. So it took a long time, and the entire field of AI has taken a long time. But we got unstuck, right? That's kind of the point, the inflection point, as we call it, the no going back, the point of no return to where the floodgates opened. We were able to now do things we couldn't before, and that's what's new and kind of took people by surprise is generative capacities of AI, bringing together computer vision, right? Taking a picture to, using your phone, taking a picture of your fridge and saying, okay, AI, what can I make for dinner with this, right? And then it can put
Yeah.
it, identify what's happening there, put it together, do some searching, etc. But then you also have the machine learning aspect of it, and then you also have obviously computer vision, natural language processing. You can talk to it. So the biggest movement really is lowering the barrier of entry to engaging with and using these tools for a variety of tasks. So, but when people say AI now, they pretty much are using kind of a name brand, kind of like Xerox or Kleenex. They're talking about OpenAI's ChatGPT, right? That's probably the most, industry recognized and popular type of AI tool people are referring to. But they're really referring to all three and all the advances that we've had over 70 years. It's just they're brought together and we're now able to lift the hood, right? So when we did our studies in 2021 on the disruption of higher education with artificial intelligence, we didn't have generative AI, but we saw in every single field it was already being used, right? So from art and design, you're going to have Adobe already had tools in order to automatically fill in different narratives for video editing. You have an education, they already had tools to help eye tracking and help people decide who needed extra time in learning how to read. So you name it, every single field was already using it. It's just they were pre-packaged and limited to the type of software that specialists made for a particular use case. The difference now is we all have the ability to train our own agents, make custom GPTs, and create these tools which are able to augment what we're able to do for a greater variety of tasks without machine learning specialization or background, without programming.
So how intelligent is the AI? I mean, I mean, of course, for a regular day-to-day use, for ChatGPT, a lot of interactions, could be planned using ChatGPT. A lot of, essays could be written, or, a simple basic logical reasoning could be done. But where does it stop, in our lives generally, and education especially? Like, to what extent students should rely on it or can rely on it, and where exactly the actual learning starts? I mean, using these models or using a software like that, where basically it's a search engine, in terms of what skills you need to use it, uh, just like prompting. But beyond that, there has to be a place like, okay, so let me rephrase the question. The question is like, are we going to now um, reimagine our expectations of learning?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So with regard to level of intelligence, we've bypassed every metric, and so we're going faster than Moore's law as far as the development of processing power and of software. If you look at what happened from 2022, and then with the 3.5 model launching February of
Yeah.
2023, the quickest adoption of any technology in history, over million users that we have in that 1 month alone. But as people are still thinking because they're seeing this in the news and they're reading the studies that are coming out. Well, a lot of studies take over a year to be published, and so they're basing it off of the capabilities of the 3.5 model, which did hallucinate, which did make stuff up, which did have a large number of inaccuracies. So you couldn't rely on it for certain types of tutoring. So you wouldn't rely on it to study for your chemistry exam for inorganic chemistry, for instance, because it could not access databases. It wasn't connected live to the internet. It was trained up to 2021, right? As far as its information, so it didn't know current events. But you fast forward, right, in less than a year, you have the GPT-4 series, which interestingly enough, I was reading the founder of Khan Academy's book. They had access to it, right, 3 years before it was launched, right? So
Oh.
these things are being tested, right?
Mhm.
Right now, the next gen is out there being tested, but has not been released yet to the general public. So whatever you have access to now, just assume that the next gen is already being trained and fairly capable. So to answer your question there, now if we look at what the capabilities are, it can access the web live. People are using it now more than Google in the sense that people don't want to say, I need a recipe for lasagna for dinner. And what does Google do but give you different web links that you have
Right.
to read through and synthesize yourself and decide which one works best for you based
Right.
upon your
Right.
palate, etc. No, we want, to say, just give me the lasagna recipe. Give me what I need. Now walk me through it step by step
Yeah.
using my smart glasses, how to cook it, etc. We want and demand that type of
Right.
functionality. We're not going back.
Yeah.
So you're going to
Even
have to
we can ask, like, I don't have this specific ingredient, so what should I do now? I mean,
exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Which wasn't possible with Google search.
yeah, and famously, people will say, "Oh, well, past AI suggested using, like motor oil or glue, right, as far as the recipe." So, it's messed up. It's like, yes, the older models, right, did make stuff up, but we have to realize that these are not the current models, right? The current models can access the web. They can synthesize information. That's what we want, is to synthesize the information. Tell me which recipe and why I should do it. But more importantly, as far as level of intelligence, this is what is very important because we think about the Turing test of whether or not an AI can pass itself off as human, established back in the 1950s. We passed that right with GPT-4, right? So that was passed. So every time we have an advancement, we raise the bar in what we expect can be done. So what we keep doing is saying, okay, it's at basic level, average level human intelligence. We did that last year. Now with the O series models, right? So O1, the Pro, if you have that with OpenAI, it's PhD level, right? So and then the O3 that they just demoed back in December is going to even be beyond that as far as its reasoning capabilities. So we have to, does it change how we learn? Absolutely. Fundamentally, it changes, as we always say, because the goal of, say, a college degree, a bachelor's degree, was to get up to speed with where things are in a given field at that time, right?
Yeah.
And AI can do that instantaneously. We have all these studies which show that we can get people up to speed 48% faster, right? We can cut the time in half of what it takes for like rote memorization to see where we're at. So then the question becomes, okay, education then is what's built on top of that. So what we're going to see now is in our next phase is we're going to have very broad expectations for education because all of us we're going to have the same tools, we're going to have the same glasses or contacts, have the instantaneous access to any information that we want. How do I change the oil in my car? How do I rewire my circuit breaker right in my house, etc. And it's going to walk you through it step by step. But then you're going to have what does specialization become? What is domain expertise now if it's already PhD level, right? And if you think of what it takes to get a PhD, it's demonstrating everything that's been said or published or done in a very narrow area of a field, right?
Yeah.
And then you demonstrate that you can add to that knowledge by synthesizing that or bringing something new to bear, whether that's going to be human subject research, primary source, etc.
Yeah.
But now we have the ability, which no one's tapped into, to be a super specialist. In that now you have this PhD level and above tutor that can move you further along than any human is in that field. So then we're going to have broad-based expectations for everyone and then hyper-focused, right? Very
Hyperfocus.
specialized things. Yeah.
So here's my own experience, with what's happening in PhD level, education. So I have, for instance, several PhDs under me, currently doing their PhD in biomechanics or in human sciences. So it includes a lot of work, starting from writing IRB approval to collecting data, which is the most intensive process, applying for funding, analyze the data results, dissemination process like that. What I'm finding is that uh, Students take a lot of time to learn. So if a new student comes, from a different field, they take several years just to understand the literature, a little bit of literature, a very narrow domain of literature, especially understanding core concepts. Collecting data takes about a year of hard work to understand and to learn, but then they get, pretty fast with that.
Hmm.
Then you have data curation and then, analysis. Those with who do not have very strong programming background, it takes them a lot of time, probably 4 years, just to be at the basic level of analysis. So a typical PhD student, I'm talking about above average PhD student, comes in, takes about 3 to 4 years to learn some really basic skills, to be able to do some really basic analysis at the end of 4 years, right? To produce a very basic thesis, right?
Hmm.
A thesis which do not even stand, in the larger schema of how things are moving.
Hmm.
Or and most of the really good stuff comes out of not so much with peer students, but a lot of your own involvement or collaborators' involvement, people who have expertise, very advanced expertise at mid-career level. So now what I'm realizing is that the kind of codes which peer students write at the end of fourth or fifth year, any AI software writes that, in 30 seconds, right?
Hmm.
And it's getting better and better at it.
Hmm.
It is much better than any PhD student, at least who I know of, in terms of troubleshooting those codes. Okay. And I won't say that it has that logical reasoning yet at that level, but in terms of overall understanding the overall grand schema and laying out the overall, theme of the work for dissemination, it does much better job than because of the information it has compared to an average or above average PhD student. So what that has made me is I'm trying to focus, my students more on data collection and skills, which AI cannot do because it's good for them because they cannot be replaced there,
Hmm.
as well as that's more productive because a lot of stuff can be just automated or those codes can be or I can take care of those, those core things rather than, letting them spend 4 years just to understand a little bit of code. So my expectation has changed, of course, driven by productivity and other, other constraints. Well, what will that do to PhD education in general? And that's not just at the level of a single PI. Universities have to rethink that. The grant agencies have to rethink that. And we have to think as a society, what does a PhD mean in the coming world? So
Yeah.
what are your views on that?
Yeah, we're talking about 1% of the population, right, in that one, but it does matter because the question we keep getting is, are humans still going to be in the loop of the education process moving forward, given the capabilities of these
Yeah,
machines? At the moment, the answer is absolutely yes, because if we're talking about PhDs, it's not about education, it's about a credential. And a human has to decide on what is the threshold, the outcomes, the standards for that credential.
yeah,
Right. So that's not going to change in the short run, in the short term. Undergraduate education is very interesting, but specifically focused on PhD. I love when you're walking through that because I just published a book just to give my students an idea of graduate students of the world they're walking into, and so which most of the publishers, most of academia have not caught up with yet. Right. So we
yes,
find that when I did previous studies in institutional adoption, and when we talked to CIOs, CTOs, CEOs, presidents, VPs, they all tended to view the problem of AI as a teaching problem, right? It wasn't a research problem. But it fundamentally changes, right, how we should look at research from identifying it, gathering it, disseminating it, etc. So I have a book on, research in the age of AI, which shows we can go from brainstorming and topics of ideas of you can instantaneously, as you noted, determine what's already out there, right? So perplexity, consensus, elicit, whatever you want. I mean, what is the latest on this specific subset in my field, this question in my field, and it can instantaneously give you that. And you can move from that to, okay, what conferences are out there, based upon and would fit within in this area that I'm interested in,
Yeah.
identify them. Okay, now write up an abstract based upon what I'm interested in and align it with that. Okay, it does it. Okay, now outline the PowerPoint and the slides for this 20-minute or 15-minute, presentation. All right, now take the feedback you got from that, use it, and then put it together in an article. Now look for journals that are going to be aligned with or have special issues or that work with whatever your topic is. Okay, now take the feedback you get from those reviewers, right? And I'm a reviewer for about 25 journals. I think I'm on editorial board for another five. So we're already seeing this. If you're going through, it's in the entire process. We have to see where is the human intervention, right, in this way, because we can take their feedback, add it to what we're saying. Okay, now apply this feedback, right? Rewrite the lit review, rewrite the significance, rewrite the results, do another ANOVA, right? Do a statistical analysis, etc. And then you build from there. It's like, okay, now write a book. Well, if you think of PhD, what you were mentioning, I'm on the IRB as well, do a lot of human subject research. And for your average person, going through the process of putting an application through for human subjects research
Yeah.
is
It's the
very
most frustrating process. Yeah.
Oh my God, it is so. And I review those, So, but when I do it myself, anything that has the step by step sequential
Yeah.
processes, which is all of academia, right? So, develop your thesis, identify, a target, identify what data you need, analyze the data, fit it within the overall schema, the state of the field, et cetera, and rinse and repeat, right? In this way. So, anything that has the step by steps, you can automate very quickly. And so with an IRB application, it's always, okay, what's the title? Okay, what is your research question? Okay, where are you going to get your participants, right? Are any of them going to be vulnerable, and considering
Yeah.
all the human sort of ethics? But every step is, how are you going to gather data? What are your research questions? What is the benefit to the subjects? What is the benefit to society? So all of it you can have in one chat, right? So and get through in roughly 30 minutes now, whereas it took, days in the past. I've been working with
Right.
some because they save it, they have to go back to it, they have to collect, right? Once again, their informed consent forms, they
Right.
have to type everything out by hand, etc. But that can all be automated. And so the question is how we assess things will have to fundamentally change because it ups the ante on how quickly we can get there. Right. So if I can do everything that you just mentioned, right, within the span of a week, and what you mentioned was getting response or getting data from the real world is what takes a little bit. But we're already seeing closed loop systems with Internet of Things labs, whereby you'll have a researcher go, okay, I want you to run and find a new enzyme or protein for rectal colon cancer, right? So then it goes out, finds everything that's been done, then it uses, models like Dolly did this for one to create a new protein strand, etc. Then I want you to design, once again, the protocols to test it on rats, right, in a lab, right? Go through, no humans, right? Give them the enzymes and the treatment, etc. Collect the data, feed it back in, summarize the data, and synthesize the results, and then publish it, right? So this is going to happen very, very quickly. And so we're really going to be looking at humans being trained as, and that's what we saw with the O3 model, is people that are using it right now, OpenAI's O3 model, which is the most advanced, is it comes up with very novel, very creative solutions to a given problem in a field, but you need an expert to validate it, right? Because it's
Right.
so good. So you need someone who knows all the literature, who knows all the domain specifics in order to say, okay, that's good. And so it's the same thing as you mentioned with coding and programming, that being, you had the head of Google for programming, you had AWS, all of them predicting, right, the end of programming. Well, that's not entirely true. You're still going to, I said, a quarter of all of Google's code is AI generated. Well, yes, right, it generates it and then a human verifies it and says, okay, this is okay, send it along.
Right.
No, this part's wrong, fix that, send it along. So they can do it much more quickly by spot checking it. And
Right.
so that changes really how we train people, is really to validate
So,
the
so,
output.
so, so it's basically, we are looking for hyper specialization because what you're saying is that like we don't need those 90% of, human resources now, but those 10%, who are hyper specialized. Uh, it's so interesting that, when blue collar work was being automated,
Mhm.
the white collar, I mean, as a, I mean, the white collar workforce was not very concerned in the society, right? And for instance, when, the shipyard workers, were against, automatization of the shipyards, people were like, that's bad. We should automate, the blue collar worker as much as possible, right? And that's what white collar worker was actually contributing to consciously or subconsciously. It's the first time which is when probably white collar work is being automatized, at every level you can think of. And you see that resistance now, right? And coming up with excuses that why we need human for these kind of things, when in fact a lot of what we do as white collar workers is we hate it. Like as a researcher, we have to do a lot of things we just hate it. I mean, those if an article can if ChatGPT can create a better you know an additional document for a grant, why did that grant agency have it on the first place?
Exactly. And so I love that you brought that up, that being the notion of automation, because we have been predicting automation since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? So
Yeah,
nearly 200 years ago, that being, we're eventually going to live in a utopia. So think of like, Metropolis and these films to where you're going to have, but even that one was rather dystopian because you had these blue collar workers, working alongside the machines. But the Stanford 800 study that came out in 2018, again, pre-generative AI, right, had stated the same thing we've seen for over 100 years in that repeated physical manual tasks will be automated first, via robotics. And so, lifting bricks, building things, laying concrete, these, stacking things in warehouses like what we see now happening with Amazon, that will come first, and then it'll move on to lower, right, white collar jobs, clerical work that's really repetitive, typing up, minutes, typing memos, things like that. That's going to come next. But they predicted that the creative jobs would be automated last, right? So think of, art director, artist, musician, etc. Well, fast forward to summer of 23, all right? So 6 months after the stable launch of oh, sorry, that's not right. Rewind to the summer of 22. So the summer of 22, 6 months before the stable launch of ChatGPT, you had this wave of AI art coming out on social media
yeah,
platforms.
yeah,
Right. And so I was presenting at Oxford at the time and talking to people, and it kind of hit me. It was seen as kind of flippant. It was seen as, oh, look, I can turn my picture into a fairy or a dwarf or something, or I can make a dragon. So it was seen as like a fun kind of passing tool.
mhm,
But I'm like, no, this fundamentally is going to change quite a bit. And there were six major generative AI writing tools out at that time when the fall launched in 22. So we did studies on both English composition with all those writing tools and art and design. And that's another book that I published on creative convergence on the creative side of things. What is this going to do? So the reason why it is so difficult to get our feet under us is all of our predictive modeling was reversed, right? And
mhm.
what they did not consider was software is easier to get unstuck than hardware, right? That being, everyone's
That's
like,
very
well,
true.
it's like, well, I don't want. I've seen this so many times and it infuriates me. All these memes on social media that say, I don't want my AI to write my poetry or do a painting for me. I want to do that. I want it to do my laundry. I'm like, that's great, but that requires robotics being paired with it, which is much more costly and complex, right? In order to get right, to ship, right, upkeep, etc., rather than just pushing out an update through software. And so they don't fundamentally realize that. But that's what we're seeing now is this year is the year of robotics, right? So we have, thousands of
Yeah.
them just shipped in January. They
And
cost.
so cheap. I mean, $3,000 you can get like really robot which you can program yourself. It's
Mhm.
it's damn
Yeah.
cheap.
And so like fully human capable that learns as it's in your home, $12,000. By next year, you'll be able to buy it half the price used, right? If someone wants to upgrade. So
Yeah,
everyone's going to have a robot to do that, but it took time because we had to get unstuck. And
yeah,
you had to be able to, I mean, having a robot's great, but if it can't do anything, who cares, right? So
right.
now we have the generative capabilities for natural language to put on top of it to communicate like a human would to it, going,
Hmm.
I need you to wash the dishes. I want you to make me a grilled cheese. I need you to go out and start the car. It's cold, right? We don't have to do that. We have automatic things for that. But you get the idea in that way. But yeah, it does fundamentally change and really reveals a lot of the biases in society to where certain roles were seen to be unautomatable and more important than others. That being, that an auto mechanic is not as important as, a physicist, right? In this way.
Right.
But in the same way, we're going to see automation and changing job roles for both, right? So you're going to have auto mechanics overseeing and telling robots what to do and checking their work, right? Just like we're going to have, once again, these machines and these language models and reasoning models, these agentic AI models, which are coming out this year. So it's, it was, natural language. Now it's agentic AI this year, which very, very specialized things you can train to do exactly what you do, right? As a scholar or whatever your area is. But then the next one's physical AI, right? So we bring the agentic AI, like a personality, a specific set of memories, etc., and pair it with robotics to where it becomes physical in our world. So then the next question is, what does that have to do with education? And so as I predicted with the launch in January in 23 is that graduate education is going to fall first, right? So because you have people that have, right, the ability, the whole point of graduate education and what we tell all of our students when applying for PhDs is you have to show them you can work on your own. You're autonomous, right? You can
Right. Right.
yourself. That's the whole
And
point of.
that's the hardest skill to find in an individual,
Mhm.
as a PhD student.
And that will be the most valuable skill. So
Yes.
that is the most valuable skill moving forward from all of our research is metacognition, the ability to learn how you learn and to upskill quickly. But the idea is, for PhDs, they're supposed to already have that type of independence and to be able to learn on their own. And now I forgot where are we going with that one? What was the question?
The question was that what would be like the hyper specialization,
That's right.
the graduate level, and what would be, I mean, what would PhD be for?
Yeah.
I mean, we understand in certain fields like wet labs, you have to do wet lab experiments. But definitely in chemistry, a lot of things can be automated. And we now know, with companies like Schrodinger, I mean, a lot of reactions, a lot of chemical reactions, you don't need to experiment yourself. The software will tell whether it will work or not. To an extent that even for my own work now, I often, especially at night, play around with these AI models to, just to tinker them that how much do they understand and they can tell that this is what I'm planning is wrong. And a lot of times they're correct. Like this, there's no point in doing this. It's already exists, or there is some, you know, something out there which shows that I would be better off doing something else. So the question becomes then, what do we have PhDs for, especially in fields where there was no, need for hard data collection or actually, wet experiments.
Hmm. Yeah, like humanities and social sciences,
Yeah.
in that way to where it's a human interpreting different human output, right? Right. So
Right.
doing analyses of literary text, right?
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, and so it's very very good at
So,
that.
so we also have to rethink our motivations because I mean, from a societal standpoint, we had two rationales for having PhDs. One, the growth of knowledge and the growth of workforce, right? Because we have to teach the other PhDs, so we need PhDs to teach the next generation of PhDs, right? And if it is about knowledge generation, and if AI systems can produce that knowledge, at least that 95% of the knowledge, because those 5% are the ones who actually produce, because how many theses on Shakespeare we have since Shakespeare, right? That kind of an argument.
Hmm.
And the second is that we don't need that many PhDs if we do not have do not need PhD. It's like it's cascading. If we don't need PhDs, we need even lesser PhDs
Hmm.
because we don't need those PhDs to train those PhDs, right? So the shrinkage, if it happens, it will be exponential.
Oh, it's happening already, especially in the arts and humanities, right? Because you already saw Boston University cut funding, so they stopped entering or bringing in the next cohort of PhDs. So there is less of a demand. We are really realistic that being, what is a PhD for if there are less academic positions out there?
Yeah.
That's been shrinking year by year, especially in again in the arts and humanities, right? So there's less need in this way as far as positions they can hold with tenure track institutions. And colleges, once again, are shrinking, right? We have the
Yeah.
demographic cliff, we have all that. So those feeding up to even be eligible for PhDs is shrinking. So as we rethink, okay, what is education actually for, right? So, and that's the big argument and kind of the big schism between the physical sciences and the social sciences, et cetera. That being, is education, as most American students believe, merely vocationally oriented to help get them a career when they graduate in 4 years? Or is it supposed to teach us how to think and how to be global citizens and how to live a more fulfilling life? Right. So those are often seen as kind of diametrically opposed. They don't have to be. But what we do know is the idea of 4 and 40 is gone. The idea that you come out of high school, you have 4 years that you have
Yeah.
of higher education, and then you go off and have a 40-year career in one field, right, cannot work anymore. Because what is required, even in that one field, even if it's semi-stable, even like a government job, right? Something bureaucratic, is still going to change what they're doing day to day and how they analyze things and what their output will be.
Right.
So we're going to have to build on and off ramps. There's been lots written on this, like lifelong learning. Michelle Geese, kind of modeled that. Several others in the value of the liberal arts. But we're going to have to. The majority of college students now are non-traditional students, right? They're working adults with families. That is the majority now, right? So we've
Okay,
been
I
there.
didn't know that fact.
Yeah, we've been there. We've been there for a while. But really, the way in which it's counted is first semester, first year students, right, are what the federal government and the Department of Education counts, right, in that way. But if you look at the percentage of people who are re-enrolling in college, there are those that got some college, didn't finish up, gotten a career, now come back to finish their degree. That's most students now. So then we have to really think about on and off ramps, right? So what basic skills are we going to need to bring them up with leveling that they might have had? My students have been out of school for 30 years, and they're really worried about, research and writing, for instance. I mean, I haven't written a paper in 30 years. And that's kind of the fallacy of a lot of how we structure English composition is how many of our students, when they graduate, are going to be writing research papers every day, right, in a corporate job, right?
Yeah.
None. That's not what they're going to be doing. So really reflecting the type of skills, as you move along. But you're right, that being the system that was set up in the Middle Ages, right? This goes back to the founding of Oxford and the University of Bologna in the year 1000. That system came out of the church and the quadrivium and the trivium, the seven major liberal arts, right? Geometry and poetry and all that. And there was this type of religious significance of your field being somewhat magical and very important and
Yeah.
holding something that no other field can do.
Hmm.
And that's really, that belief is really holding most educators behind from seeing what they can do with AI is, no, what I do is special. No one else can do Shakespearean analysis, as you mentioned, right? So this is important for this reason because they were taught that. So that model is medieval, right? So we're going to have to then rethink, okay, if the point is to bring someone up in one specific area, they do their oral defenses right at Oxford, right, to demonstrate they know everything about everything in this one narrow area, and then they go out, become faculty, and start teaching the next generation to go up and do the same thing. What is it? What is it for, right, in this way? So I think in the short term, we're going to have to start showing PhDs, right, and PhD students and recent graduates that path that we told them, that being you are not worth anything if you don't get a tenure track job in your field.
Yeah.
That's what we've been training you for. That's what you have to do, right? So, but that's impossible, and we're setting them up for failure an entire generation. So we have to show them you're gaining skills that can be applied in the world of AI, right? That will allow you to still be successful, but not. You have to make in this. I guess we can go back here to one of the most important things we found is human psychology is really rearing its its ugly head in this. So we've published over 100 studies now on what this means in education. And what we saw at the outset was strange for us. We thought the students would be excited to
Mhm.
experiment with these new tools, to have a new way in which to create art or to make a website or to write a poem or a creative nonfiction story or something. What we found was varying levels of resistance. So some students loved it, some hated it. I mean, it was anathema. They were just virulently against it. It's creepy, it's soulless, it doesn't feel right. And so we started narrowing the focus of the studies. And what we found eventually was three main predictors for adoption of these new technologies, which apply to all of us. That being number one, if we go back to the book Robot Proof in 2017, there was a nationwide study that found that human beings were more afraid of being replaced by a robot than death. So job loss. We're more afraid, right? The Terminator's coming for your job. And so number one, we found that if it did something that they thought they would be doing with their vocation, they immediately revolted. They would actually start
Yeah.
saying things like, "This is awful. What's the point? Why am I even getting a degree? Why am I learning this? This can be automated, etc." So job loss right there. The second one, which was very interesting as well, was identity loss. That being, if you personally identify
Mhm.
as a musician, as a poet, as an artist, and it does that, what are you, right? It's this existential crisis of I don't have an identity. And the third one, which is where what we're talking about, which was hard to get at because faculty will not admit it. It took a lot of studies. It's domain expertise loss, subject matter expertise loss. So what we found was AI, all these tools were being adopted and used and played with in the classroom in all other fields largely except for English composition and computer science. That being, and we're like, why is that, right? And so they were really hostile towards it, and they still are. And so we find that for English, it's relatively straightforward. That being, no, I teach people how to write. I'm the expert in writing, right? So a machine can't do that. It doesn't have the human touch. It doesn't have that. And then computer science, we would hear this. We would hear, no, we do real AI. We don't do that fake AI stuff, right? That you're talking about. We are the domain experts in AI. We own it, and we're still seeing this.
Yeah.
So they reject learning it and don't teach their students these new coding tools, right?
Mhm.
That will assist them debug things, etc., because they feel that they're the expert. But in all of that, there's also AI guilt. So we find that my co-researchers that are learning and publishing on how to automate assessment, how to automate curricular creation, rubrics, and all that, they still were spending like 60 hours a week, an insane amount of time grading, right, manually grading. And I'm like, what are you doing, right? We published a chapter on how to automate this, and
It,
they come back and they would say, well, I was taught you had to spend 20 minutes
yeah.
per paper or I'm not doing my job. So there's this idea that and especially in America, that being something is valuable if it takes time. And
Time. Yeah.
so those two things, so we feel guilty if we can do something really quickly, even if it's better quality, even if we can show it's better, right?
Right. I mean, when it comes to rubric, AI does so good with rubrics. And you give it like one prompt, it can change the rubric for a requirement. It takes that human to tabulate that rubric half an hour to an hour, and even then there are imperfections. And it's kind of self-delusional that you think that you're creating something new because thousands, hundreds of thousands have produced that people have made those rubrics before for similar kind of stuff. So it's not even a human resource put to something new or something better. Do you think that maybe we will realize, okay, so there are two, there's a dystopian view that, oh, the nostalgia, the world was so lovely, people used to interact and it was so hunky-dory, and now, it's very dry, and the Gen Z is like antisocial and things like that, uh, or Gen X, or whichever the youngest generation is. So that's one view to look at. The other view is that maybe this will make us realize that these are the things can be automated, and now we can actually put the human resource on more things like we can have more nurses, we can have more physical therapists, we can have more psychologists, we can have more of those people who actually interact with people rather than more of those people who are, just pushing these papers in offices, yeah, meeting for a coffee break, but still pushing papers.
Mhm. That's exactly right, and so that's I certainly don't I don't espouse a kind of dystopian view of what's happening unless we don't approach it in the right way. That being, if we look at what is the positives, what can we offload that we, as you mentioned, hate doing anyway, and do things that actually are for social good, that actually benefit other human beings by being with them. So as you were talking, I was thinking the people that are going to succeed moving forward, interestingly enough, we're thinking about academia, are those that make their identity small. And so that's why people always ask me, is like, I don't understand what you do or what you are. There's too many things there. It's like, well, I don't know specifically what it is, right? So if I don't identify as, an AI researcher or as a game designer or, as an XR specialist, et cetera, right? So really, it's just how can we leverage technology for social good, right? So those that have their whole identity taken up with, no, I am a PhD in mechanical engineering. That's my whole identity. They're going to have a hard time kind of moving forward. But I love that you brought up this notion of of the most recent generation, right? So it was really funny. One of our business professors in digital marketing found this newspaper article from 1923 that was lamenting how the children of today don't write letters, they don't communicate with each other,
Yeah.
but because of the telegraph, right? They write really short sentences to one another across the country. So they lamented that type of back and forth, and the wording they used was exactly like ChatGPT, right? The kind of laments of, we're losing, the ability to write very verbosely and in a human fashion. But every generation feels that the next one is going to be lazy and or somehow has de-evolved from the level that they had or the expectations they had. Everyone from the silent generation to baby boomers to Gen X
Yeah.
to millennials to Gen Z and then Gen Alpha, which are my kids' age, right? So, but in fact, and of course, a lot of people are thinking about in terms of, well, what about data privacy and and identity.
Privacy, I wanted to touch that topic. I think privacy is an obsolete concept, and I think
Yes.
you agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. And so I was on LinkedIn actually talking about this the other day. But what's very interesting to me about that was the initial arguments that we had coming out when we're like, okay, why don't we use this technology? Why don't we get ahead of it and see how it can benefit our students? And the two things we always heard were it's unethical because of how it's trained and it has data privacy considerations. And so and then we're slowly backing off that because you can turn the models off for training. Anthropic doesn't train at all. You can train your own if you want, right?
I mean,
Completely off the grid.
even if it trains, I think our researchers overestimate the importance of their research. I think they think that they're all Einsteins. I don't think any of my peers is Einstein or I am. And whatever I
Oh,
put on ChatGPT, I'm pretty sure it's like pretty simple stuff.
oh
So
my God. Oh, I
I
love
don't
that you
care.
brought that up. I love that
Yeah.
you brought that up. There's a researcher here at Washington University that we're working with on a new neuroarts book, and she was, lamenting the fact that that AI is no, she's George Washington University. I'm sorry, George Washington University. And she was saying, no, I don't trust AI because I go and use it and it's stealing my IP. And I'm just like, it's not stealing your ideas; they were already out there, right? It's an
Yeah.
aggregate of billions of points of data.
Exactly.
You're not
Exactly.
coming up with anything new. We're
Yeah.
just organizing in a particular way. But I love you brought up data privacy because there was this one video showing drones that were tracking movement of traffic and everything. They're like, oh, privacy's dead. Like privacy's been dead since roughly 1998 or 2004 or 2007, depending on how you look
I
at
mean,
it.
if you go and read like the US and Soviet era, spy novels, I think privacy was dead even then,
Mhm.
if they wanted it dead for you.
Yeah, no, I was presenting at another conference,
Yeah.
and this very nice middle-aged woman says, "How do I get it to stop tracking what I'm doing online?" I'm like, "You don't go online, right? You either pay for the product or you are the product." But going
Yeah.
back to Google, everything you searched for was going into a database and being sold off, right, to better market to you. And the same thing, social Facebook, right, to 2004, right, says collecting all the information. And even now, right, we're talking about or iPhones, etc. Right. So if you want modern convenience, you have to give up on this outdated and outmoded outmoded idea of privacy. If you want to know exactly where you're at, get directions, ping if you lost your iPhone, right? See where your husband or wife are at that's bringing home dinner because the kids are asking about it, right? The traditional notions of privacy just don't exist, right? You can't get off the grid, but it makes all of these conveniences, including health monitoring, possible, right? So those are going to go into additional wearable devices that we have there. But the notion of like Meta, that's where we're going. So Meta had huge backlash this last week over stating they were going to put hyper-focused agents right on Facebook and Instagram, which the whole point people misunderstood. They were to personalize and be these influencers that were specific to you, your interests, learn what you like, learn what you wanted to see, etc. Right? But people saw it as there's a whole bunch of fake AI persons out there, and I don't know if I'm going to talk to an AI or a real human being.
Hmm.
And that fundamentally is another thing that we're seeing is when, and this is very controversial, I realize that being,
Yeah.
when does it matter if it's a real human being, and when does it matter if it's an AI agent?
I agree with you because how many times I see, or sorry, I hear people saying, "Oh, that guy was so fake," or "that girl was so fake." So within human interactions itself, we feel sometimes that people are so fake. So let's take that subset of fake people, and then let's take the subset of AI. What's the difference between these AI agents and those people who were fake? It was a delusion that we were actually interacting with someone even then.
Yeah. No, we have I have another book coming out on AI video here
Yeah.
soon, and it involves those deep fake AIs, etc. So we kept seeing over and over again, oh, this is
Hmm.
just AI. Oh, once again, this isn't real, etc. I'm like, there was a thing called Photoshop that released in the 1980s, and nothing you've seen
Yeah,
online
it's real.
billboards or
Oh,
media has
oh,
been real.
nothing on Instagram is real.
So
Yeah.
I was like, you think it was real? Or like,
Yeah.
no, no, no. So we gave up on that. It's just that the new technologies, people knew it, right? They're like, oh, that's photoshopped. I understand
I
that's
mean,
not.
what about makeup?
Yeah.
I mean, we have augmentations for.
Hmm.
I mean, we have fakeness, at every level. I mean,
Yeah.
we have been adapting it at different contexts, forever.
I think you touched on it though, that being
Yeah.
psychologically for educational purposes is not really as important because what we're
Yeah.
going to find is AI is going to be used for personalized tutors. We already have plenty of studies showing that students perform better and they prefer it. So in the short term, that's what it's going to be used for.
Yeah.
But we find in other studies that people will rank AI output, songs, reviews of movies, right? So and interactions, they'll rank them above when blind tested those of humans. But as soon as
Yeah.
you tell them, oh, the ones you selected were AI, they
Hmm.
immediately downgrade, right, what that is. So I think what we're seeing again is that psychological fear of the machine. And I can send you an article I just published on that. There's the algorithm of fear, which goes back all the way to the beginning of human history, right? That being, we fear machines that can do things like us. So when we know it's a machine and it's Alexa or Siri, it's fine. But when it gets ahead of us and we don't know, that is somehow threatening and scary. And so
Hmm.
that's when people revolt against that. Being, if you have a telemarketer that they think they're talking to a human and they found out it's AI, they will have a very severe
Do
backlash,
you
right?
see a difference between people who react negatively who think negatively about AI and who don't think about AI? I mean, does it have something to do with some personality trait or something, their own personal control over their lives and,
Yep.
factors like that? Do you think there is something about it?
Yeah, so there's it's very complex. The one that we found consistent throughout, I mean, obviously you have the three indicators of, whether or not it's going to take your job or your identity or
Yeah.
what you do for a living, et cetera. But beyond that, if we're talking about personality types, this last book actually confirmed it. As we interviewed all of these AI video artists, et cetera, which by the way are also making commercials and everything. You saw the Coca-Cola and everything else, so it's already in everything. But the one consistent trait that we found was curiosity and an open mindset. So those that are thriving right now are those that are like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder, how I can use that. What's
Hmm.
that going to do? Oh, that could be really nice. And it's those with a closed mindset that don't want to learn new things or new technologies or new ways to approach the world or new workflows that are struggling and are more hostile towards it. So that's one fundamental thing we do know is different is that outlook. That being,
Hmm.
I'm always open open to learn new things. I'm excited about the future. They're curious, right? So that's the number one thing is, wow, I never
Right.
thought of that, right? And that light bulb moment really drives them forward, right?
Okay, so coming back to undergraduate education, we touched upon the graduate education and hyper specialization, and I think you had a Pandora box of stuff for undergraduate education. So what's that?
Yeah, and I understand the audience here may be very interested, given that they're maybe largely PhDs in a given field, about what's going to happen. They're going to be fine, right? So for this generation, education is going to move slowly. There's bureaucracy, which will slow down the
Yeah.
change, both from the federal and the state level, right, et cetera. So this generation, is fine. They will have to learn how the new tools, like perplexity and other things that are automatically writing literatures, et cetera. But the undergraduate part of education is very interesting because we have in the past had this misnomer that what you major in matters, right? So,
Mhm.
and a lot of people still believe this. But the fact is, that's kind of the big, lie, if you will, about undergraduate education. You can get a degree in anything and go on in a completely different field of grad school, right?
It
So
regularly happens, yeah.
yeah, and if you want, you can go on to law school, right? If you were an education major, you can go on right to med school. You might have to take some of the prereqs, right? But
Yeah.
really, it's the knowledge that you need in that way. So that what we really need though is how we train people. We have general education, and then once that's over, it's seen as checking a box. We have the field specific part of your education, right? Which always predictably moves, Bloom's taxonomy style from, understanding basic vocabulary and terms, right? So understanding major theories, theorems, and how to approach given problems to how researchers have applied those right up to this point. And then you kind of stumble and try to show that you can do sort of the same thing, right? So for your capstone. So it doesn't matter the field, they're all set up the same way. But the skills that we need, we can show that it's Aircole 42 in Paris was an experimental coding school to where they just had AI professors. They paid once again for the students. They paid their rent. They paid them a stipend, right, for a full year. So they didn't have to worry about working. They didn't have to worry about where they're going to live. They just had to have an AI teach them to code. And they found that they learned time on task being reduced 48%, as we mentioned. But they could do that technical skill much faster. But what they found that they suffered in are once again durable, transferable, soft, or otherwise known as power skills, right? So they weren't interacting with other people. They weren't once again learning conflict resolution or empathy. They weren't learning communication skills, right? Teamwork, leadership.
But just to, distract you a little,
Yep.
those things, the way the universities and education system has been bureaucratized and has been top-down controlled, and we have outsourced any emotion. A professor has no power over interacting with students because you are liable for litigation for any word. So generally speaking, there's a lot of pressure in academia to stay silent, to speak, to mind your language, basically. And we
Mhm.
have outsourced all of this. So for a student is troubled, it's a safer option for a professor now to not divulge in any kind of interaction or any kind of you know personal talk. Instead, refer to the student to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So we have already bureaucratized and kind of chunked out human emotions out of academia as much as we could in the current system. So I doubt how much of it still exists, of human interactions in reality.
Yeah, no, that's what we did several studies on that as well.
Yeah,
So we find that as far as the interactions are concerned, we wanted to know where they're getting these skills, right? So
yeah.
where do students think they're getting them? Is there a difference in modality, that being our online students, hybrid or face-to-face students? Do they see it
Hmm.
getting it differently? Ages, right? Traditional, non-traditional, and then
Yeah.
what do the faculty and staff think? So we did several studies on that, and we found exactly what you're saying is that faculty believed it wasn't their job. That being, my job is to teach accounting. My job is to teach, HR, skills. And then teamwork, communication, critical thinking, creative thinking, all of those skills, that happens outside the classroom, right? That happens like in sports, that happens in social clubs, right? That happens beyond me. And then we looked at students and they said, no, we're getting them in the class, right? So we're getting them from you. They didn't understand that. It was the 5 minutes before or after, right, a given lecture, especially that they found the most important for mentoring and or showcasing communication skills and empathy, etc. So it's the whole, oh, I'm having trouble with this. You know, my father's
That's
dying of
very interesting.
cancer. And so they did see that they were getting those skills there. But you're right that there is this belief among faculty that that's not my job. I just have
I
to teach
think,
subject matter.
I think, so for instance, my career trajectory, I was a very emotionally troubled kid during my college. And I think I survived because of one or two professors who were more like you can call them my elder brother or mentor, or they still are very close to me, And one of the professors is like my grandfather now. I talk to him like almost on a daily basis. So these are some people who basically created me, out of their warmth and compassion beyond classroom expertise. And I was pretty bad in these people's courses, to be honest. Okay. But despite being a bad student there in that classroom, I was there probably the best student in a very different fashion. So I think, and I don't know, how much is this desire with everyone. I feel like whether I will be able to like be like that with some student or not one day. But I think as educators, we live under a very different academic pressure from the governance compared to a student. A student has a very different perspective to look at things compared to a faculty who has to work again in a very constrained environment. And I think that environment has becoming more constrained for good or bad reasons over time. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so as far as the role of the educator and the student,
Yeah.
certainly in R1 institutions, it might not be as felt, but certainly in R2 teaching institutions and community colleges, the role shifted over the past 10 years very clearly,
Hmm.
especially after COVID, in that you're not treating the student as a student, they're a customer, right?
Hmm.
And so what the customer wants has changed. They want more of that emotional support. They want
Okay.
counseling. They want, right, once again, these services on campus that go beyond just taking a test and going home.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's also put a lot of financial pressure on institutions that they're feeling because they have to hire all these counselors. They have to pay for this additional staff. They have to have
Hmm.
these additional people to have the time to support them. But that's what they demand.
Hmm.
And so, but you're right. People are taught, and we have to go through those trainings, as you know, every semester on Title IX, on once again FERPA violations, on the Buckley waiver, on all these laws that go along with it. But as you mentioned, that one faculty member that was kind keeps people from attriting, from dropping out, right, in that way.
Right. Right.
And this is why these skills are so important. It was a wonderful study about the academy in America in the early 20th century. It's because they level the playing field for those skills that certain students didn't have. So students that come from an affluent background, that come from one with money, for instance, which is primarily homogenous, they are taught how to communicate, how to behave, how to present themselves, etc. Whereas other blue collar families, studies have shown they don't teach them that. They believe they learn that on their own with their friends, etc. And so that's really the place where they learn those skills that make
Hmm.
them successful in life. And those are the skills all employers say that they want now. So as far as what is undergraduate education becoming, it's becoming less segmented, less siloed. We're seeing more experiments into meta majors, that being, do we have to have a BA that only has classes in accounting, right? No, that doesn't make sense because accounting can be automated anyway. I don't know why
Yeah.
we start accounting. It's the other skills you need to gain that can be applied to a broader range of fields and problems. Right. But really, the outcomes that need to happen in the age of AI are, of course, AI literacy. They need to know how to use the tools and especially how to leverage them for their jobs. All employers are now saying we need AI literate people coming in, and or that's very interesting, though, that they also state that they all find it important. It's a strategic objective for their organization and that they're providing training. But then the same study with the employees say they say it's important. We're not getting any training, right? And then we see
Hmm.
furthermore, right,
Yeah.
that the ones that are using it for their jobs regularly are 73% white male.
Hmm.
and are 23% female, right? So we're already having this gender disparity when it comes to what's going to be expected with these tools.
But what is
So,
the reason for that? What is the reason for the disparity? Where
well,
is it?
the reason for the despair, it's kind of interesting. I mean, every panel and everywhere I go, it's I'm lucky to find a woman who's a specialist, right? So in AI, they're all white guys, right? So look at all the founders right now that kind of leading the charge. So there's this view, right? Representation matters, right? That
Hmm.
being, oh, that's not for me. That's a tech bro thing. That once again is not something that's going to be important for me. So that's one. We're seeing that from students saying, "Oh no, that once again is it's very interesting." They classify it as a conservative, capitalist tech bro kind of skill set to gain, which is very interesting for me because it really is designed to democratize and to give everyone the same set of.
Yeah, exactly. That's very self-sabotaging in
Yeah.
that sense.
The
Yeah.
second reason for women is that in organizations and academia, they are given more menial tasks that prevent them from having time to learn new skills, right? So taking minutes, in meetings, being on more committees, doing more of the outside work, not directly related to their job. So that being, it's harder for them to advance. It's harder for them to learn how to apply the skills in these ways because they're given other tasks that may not be applicable for those skills. So that was just a study that came out in Forbes in December. But
So there is a systemic issue there as well.
yes, and so
Okay.
once again, if you look at all the studies, especially women of color are the ones that are most automatable when it comes to the jobs, the tasks that they have. And so what we're eventually going to have, you're already seeing a shift. Consultancies are down 20% since last year because you can automate a lot of that.
Okay, so we want to discuss this topic, in detail, especially the consultancy. Well, it's a trillion-dollar industry.
Yes, yes. So,
Yeah,
what's very interesting is we're already seeing
yeah,
they're like, what is the actual job impact, right?
yeah,
That AI is having. Hence, what do we tell our students they need to know or do when they're done in order to succeed?
yeah.
Starting off, you did have think of the Screenwriters Guild strike that they had in 2023,
Yes.
right? There were other strikes in VFX and in
And
Hollywood.
and AI does really good job with screenwriting. You give it like a scene, and it gives you the whole screen right. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And so you saw that, and everyone was like, "Oh,
Mm.
okay, so this isn't going to happen." But then you didn't hear about it, right? And then you
Yeah.
had like 13,000 laid off of Google, 10,000 laid off in Meta. You didn't hear, and Hollywood is shrinking, right? There was actually a report early this week on how we're not seeing a growth in jobs, right, in Hollywood because of course, competition with streaming services and other
And
big.
also the if you look at a 2 hour movie, how much of that is already AI generated?
Mhm.
Like an average movie.
Oh yeah, so it's insane. You have $100 million film, like
Yeah.
the Netflix blockbuster Titan or whatever it was. So we're talking about like $10 million a minute, right? Which is just insane. When now the VFX can be done with the new AI tools, Runway, Sora,
Yeah.
etc. Right, etc. You still the argument is need human actors, but the production, the cost for VFX, right, is
Yeah.
dramatically reduced, right, in this way.
Hmm.
But anyway, so we're seeing reductions in certain areas, but it's rather quiet and
Yeah.
it's not being announced or made very clear. One of them though is anything that can be easily automated, such as with consultants that come in for efficiency or
Yeah.
paralegals that review and summarize or synthesize documents. Right, so all of those jobs are being reduced because we don't need as many of those people.
There was also this thing like so I have several peers and cousins and others who are consultants, and I knew their skill, when like for instance, I knew some of them who could not do a simple T test, okay, but they do data analysis for these big corporations, and I was always perplexed, like what kind of data do they analyze because they do not have any foundations of analysis. Recently, I saw a post on LinkedIn. I don't know to what extent they're true, but somebody mentioning that they were in a flight and they saw a McKinsey consultant, made using ChatGPT for their consultancy work.
Hmm.
So the question is that why is that person like who would pay that person 300K or whatever the insane amount
Exactly.
they charge or McKinsey charges from their clients to give a very generic something which an AI. a large language model can produce.
And that's why they're declining, exactly. And so, and you find the same thing. So the problem that they're having in business and in law
Yeah.
is that a lot of the entry level positions, that's how you would learn skills to move up the ladder.
Right, right, right.
That the upper echelon would give you the grunt work, that being, write this memo, write this brief, right? And so
Yeah,
you learn that you would learn the tricks of the trade by doing the work that they just gave to you that they didn't want to do, and
right.
then you could move up. But these skills and these jobs aren't required anymore. So there is this type of quick panic of, okay, how do we get entry level
Hmm.
people
Yeah,
if this is the job they were supposed to do? What are they going to do if the next level up is going to be middle management or something, right? Or partners in a
yeah.
firm? How do they get there, right? So do
This
we
holds
cut
for
the ladder?
most entry-level programming, for instance, like most programming interns, what they do can be automated.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So because it's the really basic, automatable, step-by-step stuff,
Yeah.
right? That's generally what you do right out of college. That's not required anymore.
Hmm.
So we really have to start, rethinking. Okay, if it's not something that is, a basic reading, writing, arithmetic skill that an undergraduate, fresh-faced, out of college, can do while working their way up. Even though employers state, overwhelmingly that college graduates don't have the skills that they need, such as,
Hmm.
communication, maturity, teamwork, empathy, critical thinking, creative thinking, initiative, right, etc. And so those are the skills that they're demanding that they have, along with AI literacy.
Yeah.
So really, the bachelor's degree, not to be cynical, but I have heard VPs and CEOs say that the bachelor's degree is not about education; it's a vetting process. Because if
Hmm.
they have the credential, then that tells me that they are going to be a viable candidate to hire. Right. So, but they're saying that that's no longer the measure, right? So it doesn't tick the boxes that they once needed.
I think we created these false dichotomies. So, for instance, you could have someone not college educated, somebody who opened a coffee shop, let's say, downtown, really good coffee shop, grow that coffee shop over time, had multiple branches, had like a local brand, then started, a roastery and then, some bakery and things like that. That person learned several skills, including marketing, including, baking, and number of skills that person or, that family learned over time, right? And it was assumed in that entrepreneurial mindset that you will be learning and you will be changing course all your life. Then we had these white collar workers who were going to college, and we were taught that if you can just get to this college and study for these 4 years and get this degree, you are good for life. And then you are like whatever, like a mid-pay salary all your life, and you have your retirement and savings, and you have this American dream. I think what we are seeing is that we have to get back to the basics, which was there a century back, that everyone knew that all their lives they will have to be learned,
Mhm.
and life is just uncertain. I think it was a very temporary, few decades of certainty. Before that, certainty never happened. So I think we are going back to that zone of uncertainty. And I feel that myself as a academician, and I wonder, what for unorganized sector, how much that uncertainty is. But I think we are going back to where we started in that sense.
Mhm. Yeah, no, the notion of the American dream of being able to pull oneself up by one's bootstraps, the GI Bill, sending them to college after World War II,
Yeah.
affordable housing that you can buy for a few $1,000s, and then you have the same white collar job the rest of your life and retire, right, by the late 1980s, as boomers. That was one generation, right? So, and then after that, as we see economic shifts, as we
Mm.
see what types of skills are required for certain jobs, what industries are rising or declining, then it becomes less. I mean, I really worry that my children won't be able to afford, housing, right? So it's just impossibly expensive for the middle
Uh,
class.
it's expensive. I mean, I'm a university professor. I can't think of buying a house right now. There's no way.
I know. So,
So yeah.
So these things we're going to have to address. And so what I do see, obviously education, has a role in this. I think human educators still have a role to play. We're not going to just put robots in the classroom, at least for kindergartners anytime soon. My argument was, people are not going to trust their 5-year-olds, right, with a robot for 8 hours a day. So
Hmm.
they're still going to have that role, but we have to really think about logically. If I woke up in a panic, I remember in December 2022, as I was playing with ChatGPT over the winter break, right? And then I woke up going, "Oh, this is where it's going," right? So then I,
Right.
I shot up, I wrote right this 3 paragraph email to the president and the provost, etc., and I called it Academia 3.0, and I'm like, okay, let's take for granted that knowledge and knowledge transfer can be largely automated. Let's take, for granted that how education was taught and assessed, right, will no longer work because of these tools. And then take for granted that here's the type of skills that are going to be required, for
Yeah.
the future.
Hmm.
That we have to start fundamentally rethinking what, education does, right, up to that point. And so I was going somewhere with that. You prompted something. What was the prompt?
It was more about, the uncertainty for the coming generation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, with all of that, we have to start considering what types of industries may take a lot of upskilling to get there. And so I said that the only way this works, if we're a true capitalist society,
Yeah.
then we're talking about a greater, disparity in or digital divide as well as, wealth
Right.
divide in this way. Because we're going to have a whole segment of the population unemployed, right? And so for a certain amount of time. And so the model for this would be what happened in COVID. So what happened in COVID was
Hmm.
they didn't evict people.
Yeah.
They put a moratorium on that. They once again paid workers who couldn't come to work, essential workers, et cetera, and those that had to stay home. We're going to have a government program which will pay to upskill people and pay for their living expenses for a few years at least while we upskill different parts of the population. So there's really, unless we actually rely on, the good graces of big tech to actually foot the bill, right, and say, we'll pay for you to come up and get this
Okay.
this
So,
Google certificate.
let's not joke ourselves. So that's okay. So two things there. One is that we definitely lead very agile leadership, not just at the university level, but at the state level, at the federal level. Even the states which will not see this coming and which will not be prepared for that will be at a great disadvantage and see a lot of brain drain. And already states are feeling that challenge. University system. A lot of universities are closing, I think, are looking at a lot of bankruptcies as well as a lot of existential challenges, if they don't adapt or if they don't come up with a solution. But the very important issue you mentioned about the house, for instance. So people like Peter Thiel, capitalist, have been are known for like quotes like, and which makes complete sense that for a long time we have been moving bits and we have forgotten or being efficient at moving molecules, right? And what we wanted a flying car when we got a 140 character Twitter. So the housing thing, which was supposed to be very basic, now we have shortage of that, but we never thought of abundance of AI. But now we have so many large language models, but so little housing, for instance. But as human beings, we first need housing and then we need anything else.
Mhm.
So at one point, we are talking about unemployment, for instance. But at the same time, we have a lot of need of humans to move molecules. So, do you think that there's an unwillingness to move molecules in general, or unwillingness to pay for molecules being moved? So, how can this dissonance? How can a society sustain with this dissonance that we need a lot of molecules being moved and we have a lot of unemployment at the same time? The,
Yeah,
so
no.
definitely there's a lot of scope of employment, and definitely there's a lot of need for physical things.
Mhm.
So there's something wrong with the cost system or the evaluation system or the compensation system, which we are not able to direct or make the society more resource efficient when it comes to this.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have different areas, even here, looking at 3D printed homes for the unhoused, et cetera. And so when you were talking about the advances in technology versus the challenges of the unhoused, I was thinking of I was watching a documentary, and all of those that didn't have homes had smartphones, right? So it was very
Yeah,
ironic that they didn't have a home,
yeah,
but they would go and charge their smartphone, at like a coffee shop or something, and then call
yeah.
people, etc. And so there is this interesting imbalance of focus on advancement in technology for technology's sake,
Hmm.
with supposedly, lip service in many areas of no, it's going to improve the quality of life, it's going to, do X, Y, and Z, while not considering Maslow's hierarchy of needs to begin with, right? Food and shelter. Then we can move up to self-actualization. So we're going to have to really look at what happened. I'm afraid back in the Great Depression with the New Deal, right? In this way, that being we have all these, rampant unemployment, housing is going to continue to rise as far as in demand. We don't have enough housing even here, right? In the Midwest for the population we have,
Yeah. And
which is,
there's no shortage of land. I mean,
yeah.
I don't understand where exactly is the housing shortage coming from because there's no shortage of demand. There's no shortage of land. There's no shortage of resource. I mean, the rate of lumber has not increased so much. The rate of, a refrigerator has actually gone down.
Yeah, and so
So,
every time I fly, it's
yeah,
like, oh, overpopulation, overpopulation, and then you get 10 miles out of any city,
yeah,
and it's farmland.
yeah.
And so you're right. Land is not necessarily an issue there. It seems to be our priorities. And so I was thinking about the difference between and I know the listeners to this particular series may fall on one side or the other, but there's a neuroscience researcher at Duke that I work with, who she's a foot in the philosophy and the bioethics side and a foot in the AI side. And so I asked her what kind of conversations and what are different colleagues interested in. So she would say, for those that were strict machine learning, strict artificial intelligence, computer science, they only wanted to talk about perfecting or improving their algorithm, right? So that's
Hmm.
what was the next thing. And then she'd have to go outside to, like, philosophy or social sciences to, like, okay, what are the implications once we automate this, right?
Yeah.
So just like if we can keep your loved ones alive, indefinitely through digital afterlife, what are the implications of grieving and loss and, being able to let them go, right? So those type of
Hmm.
questions. So really we need that type of balance of, yes, I'm not saying, put a moratorium on, the advancement that we have, but we also have to broaden the kind of perspective of, yes, these advancements, we're not going to slow down. I don't see anyone stopping or regulating to a degree that it would cripple, right? So the advancement of AGI or anything like that,
Yeah.
because it's valuable. It's setting us ahead. We're neck and neck with China when it comes to these advances, and so I don't see the government from a fiscal, a military, or once again a regulatory sense, slowing it down. But there's no way we can't also think about the human cost, right, and
Hmm.
or supporting the physical needs, right, of the population.
Uh, I mean, I'm trying to be a little cynical here. So, for instance, housing is very important for people to procreate. The
Hmm.
sense of belonging, the sense to have a place is very important to bring in a new kid, right?
Hmm.
And of course, if you are living in cramp, uh, the propensity to procreate will go down. In general, you will have population decline. Housing can create population decline as well. We are not living in a, with a slum mentality anymore, where, when things are taken for granted and reproduction just happens. So now, the question is, as an elite, the so-called elite, one can think of that we actually need population shrinkage because we don't need that many workers, right? From the top down perspective. From a bottom-up perspective, we think from more democratic principles, from more equity, from more, people should have stuff. People should be able to procreate in a society, and society should be nurturing for everyone. So where do you see this coming together? Because we look back at the history of uh, American capitalism. I mean, when Henry Ford was actually having, Model T made, right? He was the one who increased the wages because he realized that if you increase the wages, you will
Yeah.
have better labor. He was the one who I think probably the first one to incorporate health insurance, with your pay, because when the workers live longer, they will work better, they will have better lives, and the productivity will of the whole enterprise will go up. We don't see that kind of vision from current generation of leaders, for instance, especially business leaders. We see a very I won't be qualifying, but definitely not. Maybe it's a hindsight that it looks visionary, but definitely not that broad and that encompassing worldview with our current leaders have. So definitely there's a role of government, but where do you think that these two things will merge? The top-down idea of reducing the population versus the bottom-up idea of society being more inclusive from that standpoint.
Yeah, and so that's going to take a change fundamentally in politics and leadership. So if you look at depopulation, I was just in Japan over the summer, and
Yeah.
so they have all kinds
Same,
of incentives.
same. Yeah, I was in Japan as well in the summer.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
so,
and so it's wonderful, right?
yeah,
Because you never have to walk more than a block because it's a heavily aged population,
yeah.
and so it's very senior citizen friendly. It's very
It's
mobility
a
friendly.
it's a beautiful country. Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, it's very clean, right? So there
yeah,
are no trash cans. You just carry, I see people, you just carry your trash until you can find a trash can back there.
yeah,
But so very clean, very efficient, very technologically advanced, right? They
yeah.
got the bullet train and everything.
I mean, you can
Um,
get sushi, fresh sushi at night in a dispenser
yeah, and
next to your house.
I love the robots making your food for you and everything.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So they have all of that, but they still are trying to incentivize, the younger generation to have kids. So
Hmm.
they give them, money, tax breaks,
Yeah.
additional support, etc. And they also, much like some other countries, like Italy, for instance, in certain regions, will pay for you to relocate and even work remotely. Right? They're
Hmm.
fine. There's also areas in
Yeah.
Sweden. Well, Sweden, I think, did that as well. But so we're seeing when the government realizes we're not going to have enough. France realized this. We're not going to have enough people paying into Social Security or the system to support a retired aged population, which will be the majority, right? I believe
Yeah.
they said by 2030, right? So you're going to have this next generation retiring, and then anyone under 50 years old is going to be the minority. We see what happens when that type of crisis point of the economy and the money that we have going into social services isn't enough to support our way of life.
Hmm.
So we're going to have to get there. But what's going to happen first, to be frank, in our country, if you look at the last election cycle, and how it works is that being Caucasians are going to be and projected to be the minority for the first time, right, by 2030, 2040. And then you're going to have a majority Hispanic population, right, in this way, and then others. So there is a type of increased kind of panic of losing control, right, of the kind of hegemonic system that was built up, right, since the founding. But I think once that happens, it's going to be a necessity. I mean, we're going to have to switch over, have more women, have more diversity, right, in Congress and leadership, etc.
And more young people probably,
Yeah, and then people under 7 years of
which
age.
is already happening. I think Congress is becoming younger. Yeah.
Yes, and so long overdue, right? But they're still not even 50%, and they're certainly not a majority, so they can't affect the outcome of what should be happening as much as they should be. That being reflecting what most people want and most people need is not making it right up to the voting floor. So there is an element, I hate to say it, of racism, of once again embedded, capitalist tendencies and ideals that no longer function for the world that we live in that needs to change. So we need more support, as you were mentioning, for various social services, housing, education, etc., which certainly has always been a challenge of getting those bills through to increase funding for anything but the military. So we are going to have to look at that type of demographic shift, right, and ideological shift, right, before that happens.
Some things are very logical and very scientific. For instance, preventive healthcare in general is so much resource efficient because I mean, just a if you can save one emergency trip, you can fund like how many tens of preventive or general prescriptions. Uh, I mean, if the same person lives for 10 more years, works for 5 extra years, that's a lot of tax money. So if we start, even if you think from true capitalist perspective,
Mhm.
we would be more compassionate, I think. Because if we purely think from a resource efficient perspective, we will be much more compassionate.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be really logical and you think
Yeah,
about life expectancy for different portions of the population, coming down to access to healthcare and nutritious food, we would really be doing and saving quite a bit. I mean, billions of dollars, right? If we did what certain European countries have done, right, and outlaw certain type of preservatives, certain types of fast food, certain types of things which are cheap enough that those that are underfunded can still afford, but is ultimately, causing early onsets of, colon rectal cancer, all types of, various diseases which are very expensive to treat, right?
very expensive rate. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, 90% of the basically healthcare expense goes into those 10% of the diseases. So it's
Mhm.
yeah.
Exactly. You're right. So that's going to have to be, a fundamental shift of, it's not just those that are making the decisions, that are making the laws. They're thinking about themselves. They have to actually start thinking about, okay, if it's a system, we're going to be able, we're much more well funded and well functioning, right? If we actually put measures in place which support these instead of, I don't want to say turn a blind eye, but it just exacerbates it generation after generation until the wealth disparity grows. Because how do you gain wealth, right? It generally comes from land ownership and or the exponential kind of growth in savings that's passed down generation to generation. So without that, it just becomes a cycle of poverty. So we'd
Right.
have to actually put that in motion, right? But you're right. We are at the same time perpetuating this decline, right, by not supporting, not providing healthcare, not providing access to nutritious food. I mean, if you look at even where grocery stores that sell fresh produce open up, right, in the country, there's a very specific formula to how they decide to do it, and it's generally more affluent, right, versus
Of course. I
poverty.
mean, I mean, just look at the cost, for instance. I mean, if you go on Uber Eats, for instance, to get your food, you can get like a red pepper for $6 right now. I mean, just the fact that a red pepper can be $6 plus, organic red pepper and delivery charges and everything, you can order a pepper for $10 right now, just one red pepper. So food can be that expensive. Fresh food can be that expensive.
Oh,
But the
yeah.
question is, that. Uh, so things are changing. I mean, for instance, when I don't do Google search, when I go to ChatGPT, I don't know when did I last did Google search for myself. And the Google's revenue model is basically advertisement, right? And now my ChatGPT right now I have a university enterprise version, but I can get it like ad free for $20, right? Maybe it will increase for $20, right? So even within the technology sector, I think things will change in terms of what the revenue model is. And when a consumer does not even have the money to buy stuff, okay, so how do you grow? I think we are also going to we will see that the growth challenge if we do not somehow motivate, young people to produce and young people to have families.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And so
Right?
what you're looking at is companies have bled ink, right, for the last, oh good God, at least 3 years for the major players trying to catch up, like Meta and Google.
Hmm.
But OpenAI since 2015, we're talking about billions of dollars spent training these models. I think the last projection was one prompt that's run through the new O3 model costs $1,000 per prompt. And so it's like insanely.
So one prompt from a consumer side.
No, 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 no. The consumer. So I have the pro subscription, which is
Yeah.
$200 a month, and so I can run it an unlimited number. But what it actually costs. Okay, I'm
Hello.
I'm still doing this. Okay, okay. Go back there. But what it actually costs. Can you go back to
Hmm.
your mom, please? Okay, I need you. Well, okay, that's we're gonna have to start thinking about this. Okay,
Yeah.
but that's what it costs the company. So what we're going to be looking at is
Hmm.
an increase in the cost of subscriptions, right, and a greater limitation of the number of prompts one can run for many of these. Otherwise, exactly what we were talking about with the Google model, they're going to integrate it as Google has into all their other products, right? So that they can still have you use it, but it's fed back in, can gather data, and then once they can sell it right to other
Okay.
advertisers and companies in this way. And so yes, the pricing model will change. It has to. They have to recoup a lot of their costs in this way. Um, um, you okay now? We have to recoup
Yeah.
that. But yes, as far as how it's integrated, it's going to have the same model, I assume, to recoup the cost of training that we have with social media, with Google, with search engines, which all are going to seemingly be free for the consumers, right? But is really being used to advertise to or gather information, right, about them. Oh goodness. Okay.
So Dr. Let's do this. I think kids need your attention. We should close soon.
Okay.
And we can definitely catch up again with. I mean, I think we can talk for like hours and hours, and
Sure.
there's so much more to cover. So I'll try to to cut in chunks. We can have organized later sections for specific, going much more specific into, for instance, law, into other domains of where AI is going,
Oh,
especially medical. Yeah,
law is very interesting, right?
yeah,
Because
exactly.
law is going to we're seeing really the death of traditional copyright and IP, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that has to go away in the sense that exists now, specifically because of how the models produce things and how they're monetized. So I think of the music industry when YouTube came out, right?
yes.
So I can listen to any song in the world that I want right now. And so they had to monetize, right, their profession differently. So we're going to see the same thing with video, with music now, and with art.
Even for academic writing, I mean, you yourself have an article about academic plagiarism, that how we have to rethink plagiarism. And by
Yeah.
the way, you wrote that at the same time me and my colleague were working on that article, we or a similar article we never published. And we have such a taboo in at universities. For instance, I mean, there are some times where we use the same methodology 50 times in our lives, and you have to write that method section for 50 different papers, and you have to paraphrase for 50 different times. From an academic standpoint, from a standpoint of virtue, yes, it's not plagiarism. But from the perspective of producing the knowledge, it's an unnecessary burden we have created on scientists when the same method. Why don't we have the same method exactly the same,
Mhm.
the best possible way? So definitely we would like to cover your thoughts on plagiarism maybe in the next
Oh, yeah.
episodes.
That is
Uh,
a great topic.
it is, and it is very disruptive as well for publishing, for starting from the level of the producer of the knowledge to the disseminator of the knowledge. But for today's session, what would you say? What's your message for a young educator, not at just the graduate level, but also at the undergraduate level, who's just beginning to be in this profession, as well as to students coming to college. And by the way, we have not yet covered like K-12 education yet and K-12 teaching, which is another beast, and
Oh, yeah.
and there'll be a lot more disruptions happening there,
I'm
within.
presenting, yeah, I'm presenting to the state of Missouri, the DESE Board of Education in 2 weeks. So yeah, we can talk a lot about that.
Definitely. So, what's your message for young educators and people who are coming into to do their undergraduate degrees? What should be they ready for, and how should they think about and shape their lives around?
Mhm.
What kind of philosophical ideas?
Oh yeah, yeah. So really thinking about that's why we started skillifying things. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't get to make my own schedule. They just gave me a schedule and I went to
Yeah.
classes. But even when the classes weren't what I thought, I could always get something out of it that I didn't know. So by assuming that there's always something one can learn, even if you think you're an expert in it, is always going to give you greater returns on your investment in time and effort. But what they should be focusing on is not narrowly tying themselves to one specific skill set or knowledge set. Right. Having once again, they can of course do broader ones, right? So if you want to do, more of a kind of STEM field, so you can have a broad-based, quantitative understanding of things, arithmetically and otherwise, basic level of statistics, understanding these type of validation metrics, and but that covers a broad, right, set of fields that are out there right now. and instead focus on learning the best way that they learn. So this is what they don't really teach you that they should in college, which is time management and learning about yourself. They kind of figure you're going to learn that on your own. But that also assumes a previous generation of students that were not working, that lived on campus, that didn't have to worry about, once again,
Yeah.
housing or food, right? So, which is not the majority of students. A lot of students sleep in their cars, right?
Hmm.
During the pandemic, they didn't have Wi-Fi at home, so they would drive and sit in parking lots and do their homework next to a Starbucks, right? So it doesn't really account for the realities of what students are doing. And so, the best advice is know yourself, right, in this way. So as you're going through, what times a day are you the most focused? Are you the most productive? Right. So being able to identify that, you can then decide where to put your efforts and where to put your energies to where you know is going to be a heavy task. Understanding. Yes, okay. Another
Hmm.
understanding once again your workflow, and especially the best way in which you gain and retain knowledge, right?
Hmm.
So do you do it best by reading? Do you like audiobooks and you hear things? Do you like watching, once again, YouTube videos that explain complex scientific principles in this way? And so once they learn both the best time and the way and the circumstances. Do they need a quiet place? Do they need, once again,
Hmm.
music, right? Do they need a certain type of environmental considerations, which a lot of people don't think about? And then understanding the method of delivery, that being, so is it, some people don't like writing, right?
Hmm.
Or reading, I'm sorry. And reading is a whole other topic we need to get into, that being, what's the future of reading, right?
Yeah,
And
it is. Yes.
but yeah, so understanding how they gain
Hmm.
information and the best way in which that they are productive is the two best things. And then
Okay.
after that, really consciously trying to tick the boxes and develop the skills, right? So no one likes public speaking, but being able to talk to someone who's a different background from you, talk across difference, if they're a different religion or political background, having civil conversations, understanding global citizenry about the world, practicing critical and creative thinking, right? So really thinking about those kind of cultivation of skills. And then you can have your larger set of, do I want, literary analysis or language arts? Do I want to think about social sciences? Do I
Hmm.
want to think about business very broadly, right? So the problem with business is you have like business administration, accounting, HR, right? So they're
Yeah.
broken down. So I think we need really a greater flexibility. A lot of the majors are designed to where they have their gen ed and then only major requirements. So we
Yeah.
need to restructure it to allow for double majors and for minors.
Right.
That's the first easy step. The problem, of course, is the belief in academia that what we do is the most important, so they have to take all of my classes, right? So
Right.
they
Right.
have to have all the accounting classes I teach.
Right. I think
Yeah,
it will take some time to resolve the distinction between, how the university and departments are structured in general and what exactly is needed, for a student to learn.
Mhm.
Because definitely professors don't work in, vacuum. We have our own constraints under which we teach and we operate. So I think it will, over time, those constraints will resolve themselves, if we have good
Yeah, no,
visionary leaders. Yeah.
unfortunately, with any system changing, it's going to be out of necessity,
Yeah.
as an example. So, just like you were talking about, when are we going to focus on housing and basic needs? It's going to have to be an economic necessity, right? So,
Right.
we have to do this now. So, in the same way, I remember I was put in charge of making online programs, right, back in 2016. No one wanted to teach online. They were like, it can't be done online. You can't get the same outcomes. You can't have the same type of experience, right? I'm not doing it. And then the pandemic hit, and it's like, well, now you have to do it, right? So,
Mhm.
and so it was that necessity which really
And
drove
and
the
some universities capitalized on that, actually invested a good amount, and they created these systems and which are operating very. In fact, they were able to expand their education. And
Yep,
the ones who resisted during the pandemic are the ones who did not actually gain from those opportunities
exactly.
at that time.
Absolutely right.
Perfect. So thank you, Dr. Hudson, for a great conversation, like really interesting. And I hope this becomes the first of a series of podcast with you touching on different topics. Honestly, for the viewers, I don't know of anyone uh, who has more insightful and breadth of knowledge than Dr. Hudson regarding AI and how it's changing the society and education. So it was our pleasure, Dr. Hudson, and we'll be in touch.
It was a pleasure being here. I look forward to future conversations. Everyone have a great day.